Hello and welcome to the webinar today on Inclusivity and the Supply Chain, Unlocking the Business, Social and Economic Potential of the 1.3 billion. My name is Danielle Goodrick and I'm the Knowledge Product Manager for CIPS, and I'll be hosting the webinar today on behalf of CIPS with the Valuable 500. Just to confirm some housekeeping before we begin, you'll be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but be given the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So if you would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A facility on the Zoom toolbar, and we'll endeavour to get through as many as possible of these at the end, and we'll try and leave about 15 minutes or so. The webinar will last up to an hour and it will be recorded, and the recording will be shared following the webinar to re-watch or share with colleagues. You will receive this directly from Zoom within the next 48 hours. Firstly, I'd like to start by thanking you for joining us today and your interest and enthusiasm for driving social change. Creating ethical supply chains is high on the business agenda, and that goes for diversity and inclusion. Procurement has a real opportunity to drive the right practices in their supply chain and make a huge impact. And the webinar today will be focusing specifically on disability inclusion. The Valuable 500 is a global movement which is having a huge impact and putting disability on the business agenda. And they're calling for 500 companies to unlock the potential of the 1.3 billion people living with disabilities all around the world. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today, who I've been working with over the last few weeks on this webinar and presentation for you today. We have Marianne Waite, who's the Director of the Valuable 500 campaign, and Neil Milliken, Global Head of Accessibility at Atos, both sharing their passion and the work they've done to get disability on CEO's D&I agenda. Before I hand over to Marianne and Neil, we have 3 poll questions that we really like to ask the audience today to gauge where you are. So you'll see the questions appear on screen in a moment, and if you can please select one of the answers, and I'll give you a moment to do so, and then we'll share the results on screen. So the first question is, who considers the topic of disability inclusivity to be part of their job description? I'll give you a few moments to respond because we've got quite a few people on the webinar today. Thank you. So I'm just going to share the results with you on screen. So it's roughly a 50-50% split. We've got 48% said yes, so just under the halfway mark, and 52% said no. Okay, and we're going to ask another question now. So you'll see the second question come up on your screen, which is, would you feel comfortable answering questions about your company's inclusivity performance? That's a very similar result to the previous question. In fact, it's exactly the same. So 48% said yes, 52% said no, wouldn't feel comfortable at this moment in time. So I'm just going to stop sharing those results. And we've got our final poll question before we go into the presentation today. So are you aware of the inclusivity challenges in your supply chain? Thank you for your responses. I'll just share the results with you on screen now. So roughly we're looking nearly a third of people said yes. So there's quite a high proportion, over 2/3 of people aware of the inclusivity challenges in their supply chain. So there's still work to be done there in terms of visibility. So thank you very much for sharing those insights with us today. We will be bringing those up during the presentation with Neil and Marianne, and to discuss that in a bit more detail as to maybe the reasons why or how we can perhaps help you overcome some of those challenges. So without further ado, I'll now hand you over to Marianne and Neil to introduce the Valuable 500 and how you can make an impact. And I'll be back later for the Q&A. So if you have any burning questions throughout the presentation, please add these to the Q&A and I will pose them at the end. So over to you, Marianne.
Excellent. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to start by saying it's a real treat actually to have an audience that seems to be reasonably familiar with the topic of inclusivity. It's not often you'd get a 50-50 split, and it's wonderful to think that there are 48% who would feel comfortable talking about their company's performance in this area. Hopefully by the end of this, we will have more people understanding that it's all of our responsibility to think about how we are inclusive or not inclusive, and what the barriers are to the 1.3 billion people living with disabilities across the world. So I'm going to start off just by talking to you a little bit about why this is quite so important and what the Valuable 500 has been doing to try and move forward in terms of business and disability. The reality is that there is a disability inequality crisis that the majority of businesses are failing to recognise and act upon. And what's really interesting is that although the majority of businesses wouldn't necessarily think that disability is their direct responsibility or anything they particularly need to be worried about, the reality is that, first of all, in terms of the bottom line, it is an emerging market the size of China. So the Return on Disability report in 2016 estimated that disabled people, along with their friends and family, have a spending power globally of $8 trillion. So the business case is there for inclusivity. We also know that from a social perspective, we're leaving people behind. And what's really interesting is when you think about the workforce age and how this impacts the people that work for us and those who work within our supply chain, 80% of disabilities are acquired between the ages of 18 and 64. So that's the workforce age. And the sad reality is that even though 90% of businesses talk about how important diversity is to them, in fact, only 4% of businesses are thinking about disability and how they can remove barriers across their supply chain. So I'm going to move on to the next slide quickly. This really talks about the fact that, if you click forward again, Neil, I think, it is Neil, I think, who's in charge of this, not Danielle. Thank you so much. The fact is that we are all only temporarily abled. So quite often when you speak to people about disability, they will think that this affects, you know, the odd person who's a wheelchair user. It's a small group of society. We don't really need to worry too much about them. And the fact is that as we age, we will all become less abled. Disability is the one minority that affects every other minority group, and we will find ourselves as part of this at some point in life because we are all only temporarily abled. We've got a great quote here from the United Nations that talks about the fact that we're not just, when we think about inclusive design and when we think about inclusivity, we're not just thinking about how we can serve disabled people, we're also thinking about the issue of aging and the fact that if we can get disability right and inclusivity right, and if we can build a world that is based on this principle of inclusive design, we will future-proof ourselves as we age. So this great quote from the United Nations says that by 2050, there will be more older persons over the age of 60 than adolescents and younger persons aged 24 and under. So this is a global challenge. So if we move on to the next slide, the key to solving this challenge and tackling this is you guys. It's business. Historically, disability and inclusivity has always been seen as a charity issue or a governmental issue, but the fact is, much like sustainability, it's business that has the power to change the way we view disability. Because when you think about it, most of our businesses and most of our mainstream brands have got greater resources, they've got greater scale, much more reach than many of the governments that we work with. So really, it's about business and brand experience in terms of how we can unlock the quality of life for those who are living with specific needs. And as I say, future-proofing ourselves as we all become less able, which is inevitable. So moving on to the next slide, we have a video here that will show you the reality of how people react in terms of when they're asked to consider disability. This is really the response we hear from the majority of businesses. So let's play this video. See if it's working. So we just had
I think we're having trouble with audio on the video, Marianne. I don't think it's pulling through very well.
So this has been embedded from our YouTube video, which is in fact captioned, but the captions aren't coming through. But what it might be worth doing is sending the link out afterwards so that people can watch the Diverse-ish film. It's both captioned and audio described on YouTube in case that's useful, but it might just be a problem with the streaming.
I think it's probably
that's perfect.
The sharing over Zoom that's the issue.
Yeah, sure.
It's probably a pass-through audio issue.
Well, what we can do is send over a link to the YouTube video so you guys can watch it after the session. Essentially what this is a video we used to launch the Valuable 500 at Davos this year. And as I say, it's sort of a parody, which is quite funny, about some of the responses we've had from businesses when asked about their disability performance. What's not so funny is that these responses are based on real-life conversations. So usually when you ask a business what they do by way of meeting the needs of disabled people, they'll come back with all manner of excuses from, oh, well, we're focusing on race this year, or, oh, well, we'll consider it later down the line. It's amazing to see how many people understand the importance of diversity, but then don't really act on inclusivity. So if we move forward to the next slide, we can send the link out so you can watch that afterwards. We've also got a great complimentary video that includes disabled activists talking about what they would like to see from some of the world's biggest brands. So we'll send that clip round as well.
Sorry, Marianne, I'm just trying to get past the video now.
It should be nearly through. What I'm going to do next on the next slide is talk a little bit about the 4% of businesses that are starting to look at inclusivity in a meaningful way.
Right, second. There we go.
So I think we might have some representatives from Microsoft on the line. Microsoft were one of the first brands to sign up to the Valuable 500 and obviously are leaders in the field of inclusion and inclusive design. And they're starting to see real benefits to the bottom line and to brand reputation in terms of doing so. Similarly, Apple, it's interesting, when you ask people with disabilities what their preferred brand is, almost 98% of the time they will say Apple. And that's not because Apple do something, very specific and separate for people with disabilities. They just understand that simplification of user experience is something that is worth investing in and comes from the core of their business proposition. A couple of other interesting examples are Tommy Hilfiger's adaptive clothing range, which some of you may be aware of. Similarly, Nike produced a beautiful trainer inspired by a man who had had a stroke. It was co-created with another man who had cerebral palsy, but really the result was an innovation that made getting into shoes easier for the masses. L'Oreal and Maybelline created the first app to help people who have visual impairments apply makeup, but again, it provided great tutorials for those of us who just wanted to get better at applying makeup. And there's a gorgeous brand video on YouTube that shows the creation of the Gillette Trio, which was the first razor designed for making caring for your loved ones much easier. Then, of course, we have the Lego figurine that really shows the importance of representing disability across everything we do. So you start to see that actually disability isn't, as we think, something that is highly stigmatized, a bit ugly, a bit undesirable. You start to see how design and mainstream aesthetic processes can help reposition what we think disability is. So we just move on to the next slide. It's Christmas coming up, guys. I'm going to give you a recommendation for the old Amazon gift list, or Waterstone's gift list. Kat Holmes is head of inclusive design at Google, and she wrote the most amazing book called Mismatch. And she hits the nail on the head here in terms of what has been stopping businesses from tackling inclusivity, and the fact that we have a lack of leadership in this area. And as Kat Holmes says, inclusion needs to be made part of an organization's culture by people in the most senior leadership roles. Because if inclusion isn't explicitly part of that leadership, exclusion will be the default. If you are a brand or a business that doesn't actively think about how you can remove barriers, you will actively then disable people just as a matter of course. And this forms the basis of the Valuable 500. So moving on to the next slide, the Valuable 500 was born from this identification that there was a gap in leadership from inclusivity. So our founder is a disability activist called Caroline Casey, who's been working to get businesses to embrace inclusion for the last 20 years. And last year, she was successful in realizing her dream of running a campaign to get more leaders to think about disability when she got sponsorship from both Virgin Media and from Omnicom to launch what is now called the Valuable 500. So the next slide shows our mission. So like I say, we launched at Davos this year with the view to putting disability inclusion on the global business leadership agenda. So what we're trying to do is find 500 of the most influential global business leaders and their brands to ignite a systemic change to unlock the business, the social, and the economic value of the 1.3 billion people living with disabilities across the world, because we truly believe that the inequality crisis has to end and that business is the way that this is going to happen. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk you through quickly what it takes to join the Valuable 500. So at the moment, I think when it comes to next Tuesday, which will be the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, we will be announcing our first 200 brands to sign up. We're hoping that by Davos next year, we will have 250 brands to talk about at our press conference at the World Economic Forum. Our target is still 500. We're looking for an extension on our deadline of next January so that we can open the doors to as many people as possible. And it's super simple to sign up. So unlike other initiatives, we've tried to remove as many barriers ourselves. So it doesn't cost anything to join us. It just takes time from your CEO or your chairman to put disability on their board agenda. The number one, what you're essentially committing to do is to say, we discuss disability inclusion at board level. We don't delegate to middle management. We see it as a board level business priority. What we want you to do then as a board is make one firm commitment to action. It was initially in 2019. We've now extended that to 2020 because of the traction that we've been building. And number three, we want you to share that commitment to action, both within your business and with the world. So moving on, we want to just highlight the fact that although the ask seems very simple, considering how few boards discuss disability on the agenda, although the ask is simple, but the collective impact is enormous. So my background is in brand strategy. I've been working at Interbrand for the last few years before I joined the Valuable 500. And what I've done here is included Interbrand's top 100 best global brands. It's a list that's announced every year. And here we have 100 businesses, both corporate and consumer businesses. Imagine that times 5. Imagine if all of those businesses from the top had a disability inclusion policy, understood how they operated and how they compared to their peers. Suddenly you start to understand how game-changing it would be if everyone started to take this as seriously as the likes of Microsoft, Apple and Amazon. So if we move on to the next slide, thanks Neil, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what this might look like. So what does action look like across the whole supply chain? It's been really interesting working with the different brands that have signed up to the Valuable 500, because as I say, you might have some that already totally get this, and it's a case of working with them to help harness what they're doing to spread best practice. So when you think about Microsoft and everything they're doing, look at how they are increasing workforce productivity through their autism hiring program. And when you think about how they remove barriers from a recruitment perspective, it's just about doing that on a greater scale. And if a brand is doing it really well in one region, how can they scale that up and do that in other regions across the world? It might be a case of sharing what they know in terms of inclusive design and their design leadership to inspire their supply chain to understand how they can be emulating that kind of work. And most importantly is communication. One of the things we've been hearing a lot about brands that say, well, we are doing wonderful things in terms of disability performance. There's a real problem with the perception gap, both in terms of what their employees understand them to be doing and what their customers understand that they're doing. Some are really good at talking about disability inclusion and accessibility with confidence, the majority not so much. And then if you've sort of started to dip your toe in the water and you've made the first step towards disability inclusion, it might be a case of just scaling up your efforts. So it could be a case of understanding how you can represent people with disabilities and exceptional needs within your media, within your advertising, and how you might be able to represent their needs more effectively by speaking to them in terms of focus groups. It could be a case of looking at your brand experience and understanding where your own strengths and weaknesses are. So you might be brilliant at terms of accessibility in the built environment, but you might struggle in terms of digital accessibility and through representation. There's also the really exciting opportunity of innovating with exceptional need. So if you're working with focus groups, if you're working with research agencies, understand how they represent disability in their samples and in their focus groups, because what you might find is that you're missing out on innovation opportunities due to a lack of disability perspective. And then, of course, if you're nowhere near any of this and you just think, oh my goodness, I recognize that this is something we need to learn more about and start acting on, it's super simple. All you need to do is learn. So for those boards that don't discuss disability at all, our first port of call would be to learn from disabled people, invest in training, train your board to start with, train your management to start with, and then slowly understand what the benefits are from a business and a brand perspective. It could be a case of then starting from the top and setting out what your global disability performance strategy is and what your policy might look like. And then, of course, understanding how governance works and who within your organisation is responsible for reporting back to the board in terms of how your business is delivering against disability. And it was interesting hearing earlier on about people that thought that just who amongst you believed disability is part of their job description. The answer is that it's part of everyone's job description. Again, much like sustainability and environmentalism, it's on all of us to actively consider how we can design our processes or policies to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind. So if we move on to the next slide. I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit again about where we started. So as mentioned, we started at the World Economic Forum in January. This is our founder, Caroline Casey, on stage. We made history by talking about disability on the main stage of the World Economic Forum ever. Usually it's kind of sidelined as a subsidiary event, but it was the first time that it was center stage. And it was interesting to see that at the time, the room was very far from full. And when we go back next year, we're hoping with your help, we'll have more people feeling confident enough to attend and understand that this is part of what they should be doing. So next slide, Neil. I've included a couple of quotes here from some of our initial founders. So Paul Polman is our chairman. He supported us whilst he was still CEO of Unilever and continues to support us to this day. Unilever themselves have made a really interesting commitment for the Valuable 500. They have committed to hiring 8,000 disabled people across the globe by 2025. And they have opened up partnerships with the likes of Business Disability Forum in order to help them reach that target. Interestingly as well, Unilever also sent out a note to their suppliers asking them to join as well and to invest in understanding about how they can become more accessible and inclusive. We've also got Julie Sweet there, CEO from Accenture. And not only are they starting to think about how they themselves can accelerate disability inclusion in terms of who they hire and the cultures they provide. But they're also starting to look at what this means in terms of their own customer experience and the products and services that they provide, and how this should be woven into everything they do. And then, of course, lovely Richard Branson, who sent us a video from Necker Island looking like a BG, which you can see on our Valuable 500 website. Richard Branson has dyslexia, and for him, he totally understands why this should be at the core of every business strategy. So if we move on to the next slide, again, I just wanted to highlight that we are currently processing over 200 commitments ready to announce in the first week of December. If we had had a signature, a CEO signature from everyone who had said yes, we would have about 450 sign-ups. So it's so important that if you are interested in joining us, you're able to really get your CEO and your chairman to sign on the dotted line, as has Niels at Atos. We've got some wonderful businesses that have come forward and said yes, some even from the luxury sector that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And it's been a really wonderful opportunity to reach out and help people feel more confident about this issue. So moving on, I wanted to end on a wonderful quote here from accessibility specialist David Berman, who's based in the US, because again, quite often disability is popped into the diversity and inclusion bucket, and people aren't really interested unless it's to do with diversity and inclusion, and even then it's really none of their business. They have a lovely team of people who are dedicated to this area. But David talks about the fact that really inclusivity is part of the sustainability agenda, and that you can't really expect to grow in a sustainable way unless you think about the barriers that you have up for disabled people. So this quote here, I predict that in the same way that environmental responsibility has marched from being considered extremist to mainstream over the past decade, we will see a parallel march around design that leaves no one behind, regardless of ability. So I think we have a couple of examples on the next few slides of what this looks like in terms of mainstream activity. So again, I've just highlighted here that only 4% of businesses really know what they're doing in terms of disability performance, and therefore it's fair to assume that many won't have much clarity around the supply chain in terms of inclusivity performance. But we do have a couple of examples. I think if we flick on to the next slide. Yes. So before we move on to the examples, we just wanted to quickly touch on how we can start. So if we are not sure about our own business activity, if we're not sure about how to engage with our suppliers and the procurement chain to try and unlock the potential here, there are a number of things that we can do to start off. So number one, it's about working really hard to understand what your own inclusivity challenges are, and also what your supplier inclusivity challenges are. And that could be anything from hiring, who's helping you come into your business. It can be the people that help you communicate. It really is about working with each of them to understand, much like sustainability, what we can do to remove those barriers. The second thing is to set goals to help lessen the results of those impacts. So if you think about, again, in terms of Unilever and their recruitment objective, it's about thinking about how and who is going to help you achieve that. And like I say, that's had a direct impact on who they are working with. They've had to reach out to disability specialists because they've realized that their mainstream recruitment teams can't necessarily meet that demand. So it's about setting out what your realistic KPIs are. In order to then deliver against your KPIs, it's then about communicating this within your organization and letting people know that you have this objective, and understanding where you then need to educate in order to upskill teams to help you deliver against this. So just have a think about what kind of guidance you might need to give both your teams and also your procurement teams and your other suppliers. Think about how you can train them effectively and what kind of incentives you can give them to help them go the extra mile. And as with anything that requires guidance and encouragement, what we have to do is move from a place where we police people and start to penalise people and kind of perpetuate this sense of fear of getting it wrong. We want to move from there to a place where we're inspiring people and really going the extra mile to help suppliers design and implement inclusivity programs that will then directly support what you're trying to get out of it from a brand perspective in a way that aligns with your own values. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to give a couple of examples that have come up through the work that we've been doing in the Valuable 500. So here we have a slide with some cars from Jaguar Land Rover. Jaguar Land Rover have been doing amazing things in terms of inclusive design, not just in terms of working with people who do have disabilities to understand how they can innovate in terms of their designs and manufacturing, but also in terms of their communications. So recently they approached a couple of Omnicom agencies and asked them to help them understand how they could remove barriers from a comms perspective. So making sure that every video they push out has captioning, that they're including alt texts in all of their information and online assets. So it's been really interesting from Omnicom's perspective to then understand how they can upskill in order to meet this demand. The next example is Virgin Media. So again, one of our strategic partners. They're so passionate about getting disabled people into work that they launched the hashtag Work With Me scheme in association with Scope, and what they're trying to do is get 1 million disabled people into work, and they're working with their supply teams then to help them understand the benefits of taking part in this program. Next, we have Getty Images. So again, it's funny thinking about where we go. It's one thing saying, right, we have to become more inclusive, but it's another thing understanding who can help you get there. So Getty have launched what's called the Disability Collection. They understood that there was a real gap in the market for effective representation for disabled people. Quite often it's a bit of, the common disability image trope is a disabled person, perhaps a wheelchair user, sitting in a meeting, awkwardly shaking hands with someone. They're very staged, very unhelpful stock images. So they worked to create a beautiful bank of images of people with disabilities in different lifestyle environments to help reposition how we will understand disability. I think we have one final example. Yes. So BICO is a great, actually, in itself would form a great commitment for anyone looking to join the Valuable 500. So BICO is a soap company. They do both commercial soap solutions, and they also do consumer gifting. So it's Christmas coming up. Again, it's a lovely gift idea. But what's gorgeous is that 80% of BICO employees have disabilities. And because they understand the value in hiring disabled people, they want other companies to do this as well. So they recently launched the hashtag Steal Our Staff campaign, where they tried to get other businesses to come along, see the talent that they have and take them on to their own teams. But if you are looking to join the Valuable 500, one simple switch would be to change your soap supplier to BICO, because then by proxy, you are giving jobs to people with disabilities. So they're just a few examples of what we've seen over the last few months. I'm now going to hand over to Neil, who will talk you through a few slides directly in terms of procurement and what you guys can be doing.
Right, thank you, Marianne. So Marianne's already mentioned that with AIDS and disability, we're facing some mega trends, but our own lifestyles are actually contributing to the increased incidence of the disabilities that we acquire. I'm quite partial to burgers, but I'm aware that they may not do me much good. So we're likely to spend at least 10 years of our working life with a disability. As we acquire disabilities, the average age at which we acquire our first disability is around 57, and the retirement age is 67. So there you go, there's your 10 years of your working life with a disability. I was born with one, actually two. I'm dyslexic and ADHD, and that's why I have a passion for the field. I've been working in it for the last 20 years. As Marianne said, we are Valuable 500 partners. We've been signed up. I have been supporting Caroline on her Valuable journey since before Davos, before it became Valuable 500, in fact. So it's something that's absolutely key to what we need to do to ensure business engages in making the world a more inclusive and equitable place, and procurement plays a huge role in that. And I say that from experience because way back in the midst of time, I actually used to be a buyer. So, so I understand the power that procurement holds in being able to help change mindsets and industries, etc. So older people and people with disabilities are also workers. They're working for longer. Some of them because they want to, like this lady that I met on my holidays in Thailand. Others because they have to, because of the economic circumstances. They're also consumers, so they're our customers. So it's imperative that we enable people to remain independent and economically active for as long as possible. We've got lots of new technologies and economic models that are enabling us to empower inclusion in society. It's giving us options to work in ways that suit us. So, for example, me being someone that is neurodivergent, I get distracted easily. So working from home with all of my equipment around me and my stuff, how I want it, enables me to be more effective. Flexible working also allows people with mobility issues to be able to work effectively from home without the trauma of dealing with public transport. Things like 3D printing are delivering the prospect of personalized and localized accessibility solutions for people, especially when you're thinking about ergonomic kit, like keyboards and mice, etc. You can bespoke something directly. You can also use blueprints to be able to distribute that widely. So, for example, there's a guy that I interviewed recently for a show who is in Colombia, and he is creating 3D models for people with disabilities that he is then sharing with people all around South America, and they're printing them out in their local libraries. Things like Amazon Alexa, your Google devices, Siri, etc., are holding the potential to unlock our homes and cities and our offices to be more inclusive. You are able to automate tasks, be able to talk to your computer and schedule things, offload stuff that would have been difficult and onerous to a computer. And augmented reality gives us opportunities to support people with cognitive and visual disabilities. So, for example, this thing that is attached to the guy's glasses is an Orcam, and it allows, through optical character recognition, it takes a photo of the text and reads it out. It also can recognize people's faces and scenes and so on. So if you have poor sight, or you are not able to recognize faces, or you have difficulty reading, then you can use a device like this to be able to absorb information and find your way around in the world. Accessibility puts our customers, employees, you and me, in control, and sometimes for the first time ever, like with this adaptive controller from Microsoft for the Xbox. The thing I particularly like about this is actually the packaging, and people can look at me strangely when I say that, but it's a great example of inclusive design. This is the thing that we were talking about with Cat Homes before, where you've thought about everything and the user experience right from the beginning, from the moment this arrives through your door to the point where you can plug it in. You can open this box with a single finger and take everything out from it using a single finger. So you can be significantly motor impaired and still get access to the device. At the same time, though, quite often we're making hurdles for people to jump over before they can realize the potential of the technology and their own potential as individuals. This lack of accessibility is closing the door on talent and opportunity for businesses to make money and to do business to the best extent they can. It's also leading to a huge disability employment gap. In the UK, the disability employment gap is around 31%. So about 80% of people without a disability are in full-time employment. It's only 49% of people with disabilities. So that's a huge difference. So lack of accessibility is directly impacting the employment prospects of hundreds of millions of people with disabilities around the world. And that underemployment is unnecessarily burdensome on the individual, the societies, and the economies that they're living in. If we were to remove some of these barriers, and see a rise in the employment rate of 10% of disabled adults in the UK, it would contribute an extra £1 billion a year to the exchequer by 2030. Now, we're already doing some of this kind of work through our work on sustainability. And I know that within my own organization's procurement teams, we do an awful lot of work on pre-qualifying and reporting on sustainability. But sustainability metrics are also starting to include social factors such as disability. In fact, disability inclusion is embedded in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's actually in 5 of the 17 goals explicitly. You can't really have sustainable growth without inclusive growth. A friend of mine, Jim Tobias, actually observed that inaccessibility is kind of like pollution. Now that sounds quite strange, but actually we can draw parallels. The logical extension of this idea is to take frameworks that are designed to address pollution and start applying them to accessibility and inclusiveness. So we think of smog, this is the conventional view of pollution. It's what's known as an externality. Because when we don't include the environmental costs of manufacture or procurement in the price that people pay for goods, then someone else pays the bill, usually society that is paying the cost of that pollution. Poor accessibility is an externality of the production, planning, and procurement process. It's a kind of pollution, and it's unnecessary. Someone procured this gateway. Someone decided that they had some specifications for the fencing, and they went out and they bought it, and it was made. And they didn't think about how we could enable everyone to get decent access. So as procurement professionals, you're well versed in meeting environmental requirements and also things like information security and privacy requirements. The same kind of approaches that we have used over the last decade or so to embed this into our procurement and delivery processes can be used to speed up the adoption of accessibility and inclusivity in our industries. Accessibility, which is is really important. It's about interoperability. A lot of people with disabilities use specialist tech. They use screen readers, or they might use magnifiers, or in my case, I use speech recognition tools, etc. Accessibility is about it all working together. The technologies that we as people with disabilities use needs to work with the mainstream technologies. So when we're procuring, we need to understand that. There are regulations already and standards to ensure this. So in Europe, we have EN 301-549, and in the USA, Section 508. Much of the accessibility work that has happened over the last couple of decades has been driven by Section 508, which is a procurement piece of legislation. Both of these now make reference to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and if you're working in public sector, you should be well aware of these by now, because there is actually a requirement for all public sector websites to be accessible as of September the 23rd this year. So procurement has a key role in unlocking potential for inclusion by requiring suppliers to meet accessibility regulations and for them to have inclusive employment practices. So one way that we can drive this is to be asking for accessibility statements. Quite often when we're dealing with requests for information, we see people asking for accessibility statements, or we see them asking for evidence of diversity policies and employment policies and so on and so forth. A good accessibility statement will tell you how well a product complies with the requirements and the standards. it's pretty hard with something that is around technical accessibility for it to be interoperable with everything and to meet everyone's needs, because disability, unlike something like security or the privacy regulations, is not black and white. People's disabilities are different and people have different needs. However, the standards and guidelines give you a very good way of measuring a broad level of accessibility. Quite often, you'll see an accessibility statement that says complies with exceptions. It's fully keyboard accessible, except for the keyboard navigation of the menus. This would be a red flag. If you see something that says comply with exceptions, it's time to start asking questions. If you're going for a big procurement, it's important to engage with accessibility expertise if you can at several different stages in the procurement process. So first off, make sure you're asking people whether they comply with standards, make sure whether you're asking whether or not they have inclusive policies for employment, etc. But also, just like with the environment and sustainability, prevention is better than cure. So they need to be checking during the various stages, and actually when you get to a point where you're doing serious down selection, and certainly before you're doing acceptance, then you need to be engaging in some technical testing of accessibility to make sure that you are being sold what you're told you're being sold. So this is something that I think scares a lot of people, but at the same time, there is a growing number of experts out there. There are growing blogs and trainings available. The International Association of Accessibility Professionals, for example, is busy working on a procurement certification around accessibility. If you're interested, I'll make sure that we post the links later. So I think we've got about 12 minutes left for questions. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll open up the floor.
Thank you so much, Neil and Marianne. That was so insightful today, and I think sharing what other organisations are doing and how they're leading the way, I think that's key. And how to tackle this disability inclusivity crisis, and like you talked about, how to future-proof ourselves and our businesses, and how to build a business case to get your CEO and your board bought into this, because that's the only way you're going to get a culture change in your organisation. So thank you so much. We have got a few questions. Again, if you have got any more questions to ask to our speakers today, please add them to the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. Okay, first question, what small action then would you recommend to get started if you're a company who's starting afresh in this area? That's to both of you.
Well, I'll go first. I think, as I mentioned, the small step is essentially learning from disabled people and learning about what those barriers are. So whether it's in terms of who you're hiring, who you have enlisted to help you with your research and development, when you look at the different environments you operate in and how you're communicating, I think it's important to make sure that you've got that perspective from disabled people at every part of the customer and brand journey. So understand, first of all, what the barriers are, and learn and co-create with disabled people to understand how to overcome them. So learning is the first thing.
I think that's absolutely fine. I think that there are some things that we can do as well as learning, and there are some structured frameworks to look at things like accessibility maturity model that are publicly available through organizations like the Business Disability Forum, which is basically you run through a sort of self-assessment, and that will give you a framework for looking at where you are as a business. It's not meant to be judgmental, and certainly one of the things that I would recommend is that you do not judge yourselves too harshly when you're starting this. Every business that I know, every organization that I know, knows that they can do better, feels that they can do better, and really it's about starting that journey. So please don't try and boil the ocean. Do think about what you want to do, where you are now, and how you align that with your strategic goals, because not every company is going to do the same thing. So it's really about thinking, where are the things that what is it the organization's interested in? How can we align our inclusion efforts to the stuff that the organization is trying to do?
That's some good advice there. Thank you, Neil. I think, like we've talked about throughout the presentation, small changes have this cumulative effect, don't they? So even just making the first step and starting to make change and starting to look at where you can influence is really key. So people should kind of look at their supply chains and, like you say, take the time to understand and align to business goals. So thank you very much for that. A lot of this is coming, and what you've talked about today comes down to influence and procurement's influence within their organisations and also the supply chains as well. And with some of the valuable 500 companies that you're engaging with, what are they doing in their supply chains, and where have you seen the best effect?
So again, I think some of the examples I gave start to show the interesting ways in which they are starting to impact their supply chain. So for instance, we've had both Unilever and Virgin Media write out to every one of their suppliers to get them to, first of all, put disability on their board agenda and also engage with things like the Work With Me scheme. So first of all, it's working. They've been working really hard to look at who is representing those organizations and who's working for them to make sure that they've got the right perspectives in the room. It's a bit like the old story with Beyonce and Reebok, and how she went into Reebok to talk about a possible collaboration and was met by a sea of white faces and said, right, none of you represent what I need, I'm going to get up and leave, and then went to, I believe it was Adidas instead. So it's so important to have those different perspectives working on the teams that are representing you. And we're starting to see that, especially in terms of how creative agencies are starting to work with some of our valuable 500 brands. So again, in the case of Jaguar Land Rover, they're now starting to think about writing into their procurement agreements that whoever does come forward to pitch must show what they're doing by way of disability inclusion and accessibility, because they want to know that whoever is going to be producing their communications will be doing so in a way that is fully accessible. So they're starting to kind of rethink what they're doing in terms of procurement policies and RFPs.
And if I'm to go into the sort of more technical ends of that, you can include requirements to meet the standards in your RFPs. You can, we're certainly working with some of the people that are manufacturing the procurement software to look at how we can inject this into the standard workflows for procurement as well. So things like SAP Ariba, for example. And then also we're, as our own organization, Atos, we are doing environmental and sustainability monitoring through a tool called EcoVadis. We've added in accessibility and inclusivity questions into that as well. So there is automated questioning of all of our supply chain on an annual basis to make sure that we're measuring what they're doing and capturing what they're doing. And when you've got thousands of suppliers like we have, it's quite a big effort, but sending out that consistent message every year, asking them to do this and continuing to monitor, and where they've slipped backwards, having those conversations sends quite a strong message. And then when it's focused around people, again, requiring that our suppliers of people have policies around disability inclusion and are delivering training on this stuff is key. And we've been doing this in the UK for a long time. We're rolling this out internationally.
Just a question from me. How are you finding the adoption with organisations? Are you finding that the awareness is there when you go into organisations? Is it getting better the more you work with? What's the spectrum of differences?
So I've been doing this for a while, a good 10 years in this particular role. It's an awful lot better now than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, as members of the sort of Business Disability Forum, there were lots of UK businesses, large ones, all asking the same question, all getting the answer, well, this is the first time anyone's ever asked me for this. That's not happening anymore. People are aware of the issue. Organizations are aware of the issue. Even if they're not perfect, we are seeing a massively growing awareness of the need to do this. And that's only going to continue because in June 2022, the European Accessibility Act comes into force. So not only are public sector going to have to be delivering accessibility, but all private sector organizations are going to have to consider accessibility of their products and services as well. So you may as well start now and encourage your supply chain to start now, because this is not going away.
No, it's not going away, and I think it was on one of your first slides, Marianne, in terms of the spend of people with disabilities and their families and friends. Was it $8 trillion?
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. That's a huge risk for organisations, isn't it? If they don't look at this within their businesses and take it seriously, it's a risk for future growth as well. Would you say?
Oh, well, when you think about Apple, for instance, who, like I say, weave this into everything they do, they were the first business to reach $1 trillion in terms of revenue. And then you compare that to the astounding case in the US, where Domino's Pizza recently went to the Supreme Court to get out of making their website accessible. It's fascinating to see the kind of, like I say, the financial benefits and the financial objectives to removing barriers and to being accessible versus the reputational damage it can do if you don't take this on. So it's nonsense to think that this is something that isn't worth investing in.
Yeah, and it could have a huge negative impact on your organisation or your competitors who are doing something, obviously, within their supply chains or their business could obviously overtake, couldn't they, or be given opportunities over and above you as well. So thank you. We have got a few more questions. One is around public sector, which I think we're going to take offline because this is mainly focused around the private sector, isn't it, Marianne? So we'll pick that question up separately on how government can kind of add this to their supply chain strategy. We've also got another question on how primary and secondary education for both able-bodied and disabled are linking with employers or vice versa. Can employers tap into this?
So the question is yes, absolutely they can. There are a number of small organisations who are looking to help graduates with disabilities, but I think they also help people who are non-disabled. So for instance, if you check out employability, they seem to be doing great things linking up students with full-time employment. And I think there are a number of other specialist organizations that do this. I think that it's a really interesting opportunity for people that can plug the kind of the talent pipeline gap that we have between people who are in education but might struggle to study their preferred areas of interest due to their disabilities. And there are a number of ways that people are starting to do this. So for instance, I know that there are a couple of design agencies that are starting to look at creating their own internships specifically for people that have got disabilities, because they know that they're able to help give direct experience there. So the answer is yes, check out employability. I know they've been doing great things. I think the BDF can also help with this as well. But what we're starting to see more of, which is very exciting, is standard recruiters such as Reed starting to think about, and Monster, I know, are starting to lean into this area as well. So I think it's about making sure that this goes as mainstream as possible.
Great, thank you, Marianne. We've got one last question which we should be able to fit in just before we close. So it's around dyslexia, and do you feel that this is being taken as seriously as a disability?
If I was to answer that question a couple of years ago, I'd say no. I think that what is happening is that there has been a surge in interest in the sort of overarching theme of neurodiversity, and people are coming forwards, and because it's a hidden disability, people often don't talk about it. I think the more we talk about it, the more we're open about it, and also share that it is something that also people with dyslexia, people who are neurodivergent, have strengths as well as weaknesses. We can actually have a real positive contribution to the workforce and society. There are tools available to help people and strategies as well. And it really is, I think, probably one of the most exciting times to be in this particular area, because people are coming forward, they're talking about it. There's an understanding that it's not just a learning disability, it's also, it's a difference. So we're really good at some things and really bad at others. And that if you focus on the really good rather than the really bad and just support people where they're weak, then you're going to end up with, you know, loyal and very productive employees.
Yeah, and I'm sure this early support will lead to like a better outcome in the future as well, and in the longer term.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I think we've got through everything that we can in the time today. So just on behalf of CIPS and attendees today, thank you so much, Marianne and Neil, for joining us and raising the profile of the Valuable 500, and with hopefully some of you looking to put some of this in practice in your businesses. We will share the recording, as we mentioned at the beginning. You should get that within 48 hours directly from Zoom. We'll also include the link to the Diversis video that we didn't manage to show on screen earlier on, and I will also include Neil and Marianne's details should you have any further questions and want to reach out directly. And just on behalf of Marianne, Neil and I, thank you to everyone who's attended today. I think it means a lot to all of us for you attending and showing your enthusiasm as a part of this journey. For CIPS members who've joined today, please log your 1 hour CPD for joining today. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope you join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.